It is 12:34. You are listening to the Mid-Morning Talk on Salam Media with me, Mari Mokwanda. And if you've ever been wondering what occupational rent is and had no idea where to even start, then sit back because we have the Gauteng Regional Manager for Rawson Properties, David Jacobs, here with us to give us some more insight and information regarding occupational rent. Some of you are probably thinking occupational therapy, occupational who, occupational what? Yes, occupational rent. David, a good afternoon and thank you for joining me.
Hi, Miriam. Thank you very much. Sorry, I think I need a bit of occupational therapy. My camera didn't work. I couldn't get it set up, and but here I am. So all ears, and it's lovely to be with you and the guys. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for joining us. So let's start off by defining what occupational rent is. Just give us some insight into it.
So I think to start off with the process of occupational rent is what we call an implied lease. So what basically happens is what we always advise customers when there's a sale agreement in place. So when a seller sells to a buyer and that offer to purchase in place, you need to then define and decide when the date of occupation is going to be, when the actual move is going to take place. So that's quite a tricky thing. We generally in our offer to purchasers advise sellers and buyers to try and make occupation on date of transfer. But we all know that that is literally impossible because it's impossible to understand how long the transfer process is going to take place, how going to take for, how long the conveyancing process is going to be. So it's really difficult to determine a physical date because of personal circumstance on both the buyer and the seller side. So what we then do is we determine a period as to when more or less the transfer will take place. And if it happens either side of those two dates, either the buyer will pay a lease or a rent amount to the seller, or if it takes later, the seller will pay a lease amount to the buyer. And that is more or less what occupational rent is. It is what's payable for the occupant to the legal owner at a given time of a property.
Mm-hmm. All right. So who do individuals pay their rent to?
Okay, so to try and simplify it, it's paid to either the buyer or the seller, but it's not that simple. Okay, because so if for instance the occupational date or the transfer date is prior to the seller moving out, the seller will extend his stay within his residence for 2 or 3 weeks or a month and a half or how long ever it is, and then pay that rental amount to the buyer. Other way around, if it happens later and they've decided on an early occupation date for the buyer will pay the rent to the seller and up to the date that the transfer takes place and the buyer actually takes occupation of a property. But it's interesting to know that it's in a lot of instances, for instance, there's still a bond on the property. There might be arrears on the bond. The seller might be in arrears. So all occupational rent gets paid to the conveyancing attorney into their trust account, and they will distribute it fairly to who they believe should be the fair recipient of the money. It might be the bank if there's an arrear amount on the seller. And I think that causes a lot of confusion and unhappiness, that a seller believes that someone's renting my property, but they're giving the money to the bank, but the bank still has the original title of a property at that stage. So I think that's quite important to also for our viewers to understand.
Mm-hmm. You're speaking about that. What are some clauses or points to check in the occupational rent clause or statement?
Yeah, I think there must be a good understanding between the seller and the buyer, and it is difficult because, as I said, that actual date of transfer is so difficult to determine. So I think a lot of people just run into it and think, oh, it's going to happen. There must be a good in writing agreement between the buyer and the seller. So if there's good understanding, if it happens on this day, I'm going to pay you rent. If it doesn't happen on that day, you're going to pay me rent. So very good understanding as to what happens. There's a lot of myths around, when occupational rent is paid. like I said earlier on, it's an implied lease. So should there be a separate lease signed in place? There shouldn't have to be. It's really not necessary. A lease agreement in our laws is a verbal agreement suffices. It's. I can give you the keys of my property and you can take it, and there's an agreement between us. We have a sale of a property according to the Alienation of Land Act, a bit different. It has to be in writing. So we just advise all our customers, make sure that as soon as you start determining these things, put something in writing, put an addendum to the original agreement of sale in place that says things have changed, circumstances have changed, let's change the date to that, and that is what the occupational rent terms are going to be going forward between you and me.
Hmm. And regarding numbers, how is the rent calculated?
Yeah, so there is actually no fixed formula or no fixed
Hmm.
fee. There is in a way, but there's not. But let me explain. So typically in our group in Rawson Properties, we'll go to our areas because we'll go into our rental books and have a look and see what is a fair rent payable for a property of that value in the current market at that given time. So we'll try and apply that metrics to it and say, okay, that's more or less it. But there are numbers as well. So you can look at currently, it ranges between 0.55% and 0.7% of a property value. So if a property value is R1 million, let's just take it for easy numbers because I haven't got my calculator handy. So for easy numbers, so if we're on a 0.55 scenario, which our book currently is more or less on a 0.55% scenario, the occupational rent will be set at more or less 5,500 Rand a month. If it's at a zero point 0.7 scenario, just after the big depression or whatever we called it, recession in 2008, it was at a 0.7 because rental market was a bit higher. It was at 0.7, so it will be 7,000 Rand on a R1 million property. So I wouldn't like our viewers to go and take that and say, hey, let's took that number that David's giving us as an absolute figure. We
Yeah.
have to play with the areas that we're in. But I think that'll give a fair ballpark figure as to what we're looking at.
Hmm. Right. Well, that does make sense because I mean, it's pointless to just go out and assume that this is what you're set to pay just because the numbers look right or are in your favor. So,
Yeah,
yeah. Thank.
absolutely. And very often it's part of a negotiation process. A
Hmm.
seller might come down in his price and say, but then there's no occupational rent, and then
Hmm.
they agree to that. And it's all up to the negotiations at the time between the buyer and the seller and the real estate agent that facilitates this process between them. So there's no hard figures on it. It could vary based on the negotiations of a transaction at the point of sale.
Hmm. All right. And when does this amount become payable? And if it's not paid within that stipulated time, are there any penalties that the person can
Mm.
incur?
Yeah, so it's funny that to explain, but occupational rent is actually an agreement
Hmm.
aside from the sale agreement. It's almost
Yeah.
like I said, it's an implied lease. So it is paid upfront, payable upfront to the conveyancers, and I urge people to make sure that is payable upfront and paid upfront before people make decisions to move or to allow a buyer or a seller to move or out or into the property. So it is payable upfront. And once you move into an occupational rent stage, then it becomes a lease agreement. And
Hmm.
then normal eviction procedures take place. If the rental tribunal actually has jurisdiction over it, it becomes a lease. Then it then starts falling out of the ambit of the sale of a property, and it becomes a lease at that stage. And normal processes will have to take place.
All right. So thank you so much for your time, David, and for the advices that you've just shared with us. But quickly, what are some take-home tips that we can get for first-time buyers?
For first-time buyers, I think the market's very good for first-time buyers. We've seen on our books a massive increase on first-time buyers entering the market, and it all has to do with various things. But I think the biggest thing that there's time to mention here is the lower interest rates. So I think first time buyers, be careful and make sure that you still budget well, because we might not see these interest rates at the rate that they are now for years to come. So make sure that there's affordability in place, that you build a bit of capacity for yourself in place to do that. But if I was a first time buyer, there's massive appetite from the banks. It's a long-term investment, and if you're into a long-term investment, I really do believe it's a good time to climb in.
All right. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Miriam. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye bye. Right, that was David Jacobs, the Gauteng Regional Manager for Rawson Properties, taking us through occupational rent and everything that you need to know. You can leave your comments in the comment section or send them to us on WhatsApp. The number is 061 766 0355. Stay with us. We will be right back.